So at the time of this recording, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is just a few weeks away, releasing on December 4th. Exactly 1 week later, on December 11th, is the 2025 Game Awards, hosted by Jeff Keighley, which will no doubt feature plenty of new game reveals. Now, Nintendo are, as Arlo likes to say, the kings of left field. You can never really predict what they're going to do. When it comes to TGA, they're a bit of a wild card. Some years they make substantial announcements, like the reveal of Persona's Joker in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and other years they're virtually absent from the show. Although Nintendo can be quite unpredictable, I theorize we may actually see new post-launch Metroid Prime 4 content announced at this year's Game Awards, and I have several pieces of evidence to support my theory. So, let's dive right into it. First of all, let's explore why I think Nintendo may be working on DLC for Prime 4, and why I think it could get announced so close to the game's release. This sort of thing is nothing new for Nintendo. Most recently, it was announced that Pokemon Legends ZA would be getting a paid expansion in the form of Mega Dimension, which was announced in the September Nintendo Direct well before the game even came out. In that same presentation, we also got the announcement of DK Island and Emerald Rush DLC for Donkey Kong Bonanza, which had just released less than 2 months prior. This all seems to be a deliberate business strategy on Nintendo's part, releasing additional paid content to help offset the extra expenses that go into developing games in 4K. Not only are games more costly to make, but in today's economic landscape with rampant inflation and tariffs and all that fun stuff, Nintendo is keen to ensure that their revenue won't take a hit. For many, the practice of releasing additional paid DLC so close to a game's launch feels scummy and anti-consumer. These people feel that Nintendo is deliberately withholding content from the game so they can repackage it separately for extra money, and these feelings are understandable. However, when you consider the dire state of the games industry and how just about every other company except for Nintendo has been hit with massive employee layoffs, well, it's hard for me to stay too angry. In fact, Nintendo is one of the few companies out there actively increasing their employees' salaries, and they're considered one of the most desirable businesses to work for in Japan, with tremendously high employee satisfaction and low turnover rates. Now, I'm not here to argue over the ethics of Nintendo's pricing strategy, that's a topic for another day, but whether we as consumers like it or not, Nintendo has set a precedent of releasing paid DLC shortly after a game's initial release, and I don't expect to see that pattern change anytime soon. As I said, video game development has gotten increasingly expensive, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Metroid Prime 4 is Nintendo's single most costly game to date. Beginning all the way back in 2017, over 8 years ago, the project ran into some serious development issues, and in early 2019, Nintendo came out and said they were scrapping their initial design framework and would be starting development all over from ground zero and with a different development studio at the helm. For the next several years, there was nothing but radio silence. When Nintendo announced Metroid Dread in their E3 2021 presentation, they assured fans that development on Prime 4 was progressing smoothly. This is something they would reiterate with the announcement and release of Metroid Prime Remastered a couple years later. It wasn't until last June that we finally got our first look at the game in action. So yeah, Metroid Prime 4 has had a tumultuous development cycle, to say the least. Visually, it looks to be Nintendo's most graphically impressive game to date, and Nintendo recruited incredibly talented AAA industry veterans for this project, developers who worked on titles like Call of Duty, Halo, and other such renowned titles. Hiring someone with a pedigree like that doesn't come cheap. Nintendo has almost certainly spent several $1,000,000 working on Prime 4, and this is despite the fact that historically, Metroid games have never been massive sellers. Most games in the franchise typically only sell around 1 to 2 million units, with 2021's Metroid Dread being the best-selling title at over 3 million units. Honestly, that's not much when compared to games like Animal Crossing New Horizons, which has sold over 48 million units, or Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which has roughly sold a staggering 70 million copies. Metroid Prime 4 may actually be one of those rare examples of Nintendo making a loss on one of their games. Now, Metroid Prime 4 could indeed be the first game in the series to buck the trend and sell as many units as Nintendo's heavy-hitting franchises. Realistically though, I'm not expecting that, particularly considering the fact that Nintendo's ground-up remake of the first Metroid Prime game, which released at a very reasonable $40 price tag, didn't exactly light sales records on fire. Nintendo is taking several measures to offset this game being a financial flop though, including the release of 3 brand new Metroid Prime amiibo, as well as the newly released Metroid Prime 1 through 3 art book. That's all well and good, but given the hardcore collectors make up such a niche percentage of the overall Nintendo fanbase, will that alone be enough to recuperate lost profits? This is where paid DLC comes into play. And if there's any Nintendo franchise that deserves to have an overpriced expansion that feels like it should have been included in the base game, well, like it or not, it's Metroid. It feels a lot more gross with a game like Pokemon Legends ZA, which comparatively had a much shorter development time. The Pokemon Company has become notorious for rushing out unfinished games, which feels especially like a slap in the face to consumers when the franchise is already such a financial juggernaut. Like, they could have included Mega Dimension in the base game and still had massive profit margins that every other game dev could only dream of. But Metroid? This one isn't a rush job, and it isn't the most popular entertainment IP on the planet like Pokemon. Nintendo has spent 8 years fine-tuning this game to make sure that the final product lives up to fan expectations. And for what? A game that's probably barely going to outsell ARMS? From a business standpoint, it would be asinine for Nintendo to not make the most out of the assets they've already made. So, yeah, I would be shocked if this game doesn't get post-launch DLC, with a more difficult new campaign that reuses a lot of the base game's existing assets they spent so much time and money developing. In fact, this would almost perfectly mirror what happened with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. First announced in 2014 for the Wii U, the game suffered numerous delays. It was pushed back from 2015 to 2016, then finally released in 2017. It's understandable why it took them so much time to make the game, considering the scale of its massive open world as well as its impressive physics engine. It's also easy to imagine how Nintendo likely spent a boatload of money on research and development for this title. So, shortly before the game's release, Nintendo made the controversial decision to announce 2 separate waves of DLC for the game, which you could pre-order ahead of time. Despite the fact Nintendo hadn't even started working on the new content yet, in retrospect it makes perfect sense why Nintendo did this. Hot off the tail of the failing Wii U, there was no guarantee that Breath of the Wild, or even the Nintendo Switch for that matter, would be a massive financial success. Up until that point, the average Zelda game sales numbers really weren't all that high. The game with the most units sold was Twilight Princess, but even that didn't manage to crack 10 million copies. It was still a heck of a lot more profitable than Metroid, but still not nearly the financial juggernaut that is Mario or Pokemon. With Breath of the Wild, all of that changed, selling over 33 million units and counting. But releasing the game by itself without any additional paid content and expecting it to turn a major profit would have been a gamble. Despite being proud of what they achieved with this ambitious open-world Zelda adventure, they clearly weren't confident that the sales numbers would be as high as the game deserved. I say this because ahead of Tears of the Kingdom's release, Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma said definitively that the game would not get any additional content. And why is that? Well, if you ask me, it's because they didn't need to. That style of Zelda game had already proven itself as a massive hit among general audiences. Whereas when its predecessor, Breath of the Wild, released, they didn't know if it would be enough to break out from the niche audience of hardcore gamers. This is exactly where we're at with Metroid today. I also want to point out that when The Champion's Ballad, the second wave of DLC for Breath of the Wild, was first shown off, complete with Link riding on a motorcycle, the trailer made its debut at the Game Awards. Between this and the aforementioned Joker reveal for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Nintendo has already established a pattern of announcing substantial post-launch game content at this event. Going beyond this, it feels like Metroid and the Game Awards is a pairing that was always meant to be. Where did Metroid Prime 4 get nominated for Most Anticipated Game in 2024? The Game Awards. Where was Metroid Dread nominated for Game of the Year in 2021? The Game Awards. For years, where was Metroid Prime HD Trilogy rumored to get announced? The Game Awards. Where was Reggie when he wore that Samus pin to announce Cranky Kong and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze? The Game Awards. Metroid fans have been getting snubbed time and time again at the Game Awards with false hope and red herrings. It's time we change that. It's also worth noting that Metroid is one of Nintendo's darker, grittier titles when compared to their more cutesy and colorful series like Mario and Kirby. This makes Metroid a perfect fit for the Game Awards, which generally targets a more mature audience. I mean, where else are you going to see somebody drunkenly flip off the camera while exclaiming, "F the Oscars, am I right?" That's not to say there are no family-friendly games that get announced during the TGAs. Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled was announced there in 2019. Last year we had the announcement of Okami 2, and the year before that, Sega teased their initiative to revive classic franchises like Crazy Taxi and Jet Set Radio. But in the midst of those announcements are always plenty of M-rated trailers with blood, gore, and strong language, so I wouldn't say it's the ideal venue if you're wanting to market toward children specifically. It was a perfect fit though for Nintendo to announce ports of Bayonetta 1 and 2, as well as a teaser for Bayonetta 3, an M-rated franchise. It was also the perfect venue to show off Joker in Smash Bros., a character from Persona 5, which is also a mature-rated title. Now that's not to say that Metroid is an inappropriate game for children, nor is Breath of the Wild, which was featured prominently at the Game Awards several times, even as early as 2014, where we saw our very first gameplay courtesy of Miyamoto and Aonuma. But Metroid and Zelda, I think, are unique in that they can be played and enjoyed by kids, but teens and adults tend to get the most enjoyment out of them. I mean, Breath of the Wild and Metroid Dread, for example, have a pretty steep difficulty curve. Kids are more likely to get frustrated with Metroid's difficult boss fights and labyrinthine level design, and they might lose their patience while solving intricate Zelda dungeon puzzles and trying not to get one-shotted by a guardian. Between all the dialogue in Zelda games and the visor scanning in Metroid Prime, these franchises also have a lot of text to read to understand the full lore, something a lot of kids simply aren't going to appreciate. So, unlike Mario games, which have a much lower barrier of entry, Zelda and Metroid are two franchises that age like a fine wine, where you can really get the most out of them when viewing it from an adult lens. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying children can't still enjoy these games. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who maybe see this and want to comment saying you beat every mainline Zelda game by the time you were 10, and that's great. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, I'm just saying I just feel like there are a lot more adult Zelda and Metroid fans than there are kids, which isn't necessarily the case for Mario, for instance. And that's why, despite these not being bloody, M-rated games with egregious amounts of sex and other forms of debauchery, I still think they fit well within the target audience of older core gamers who tune into the Game Awards. That's all I'm trying to say, just so we're clear. I'm not saying kids can't love Zelda. The last point I want to make is that I think Nintendo knows and understands the Metroid fanbase has been ravenous for new Prime gameplay for 18 years now. Metroid Prime 3 released all the way back in 2007, and since then the only things they've had to satiate their appetite for a 3D Metroid game are Metroid Other M, a game met with pretty negative reception, Metroid Prime Federation Force, a game met with overwhelmingly negative reception, a Wii compilation of all three games which added pointer controls and little else of value, and a remake of the first game which, while fantastic, didn't add any new content for returning players. So, in addition to their own self-serving purposes, I think Nintendo is thinking about DLC for Metroid Prime 4 as a way of throwing a bone toward longtime fans who have been waiting for this for so many years. Hopefully, this extra content would help make the wait until Metroid Prime 5 a little more palatable. Anyway, that's my reasoning behind why I think we could get the reveal of a Metroid Prime 4 Beyond paid DLC expansion at the Game Awards. Boy, is that a mouthful. Let me know down in the comments below. What are your thoughts? Do you think your boy is cooking with this theory, or am I just peddling a crackpot conspiracy? What are your hopes and predictions for the 2025 Game Awards, and who do you hope will win Game of the Year? Be sure to let me know, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for lots more gaming content. With that, I'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye!